Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you. Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, and how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative discussion of financial literacy. With Professor Anthony Rivecchio, your financial problems will be solved at Parrot TV with Financial Focus University. Hi, welcome to Foreign Policy Review. I'm Dustin Pickering, your noble and honest host. We're yet again exploring the dilemma of poetry and politics. Just how much is poetry political? How much is the personal the political? And what is a poet's role in the making of the polis? So I'm going to kick over to CARLO PARCELLI, my co-host. We have MAGUS here with us as well. And we're going to continue our wonderful discussion we had a few weeks back. So, CARLO, what kind of questions would you like to pose for the this morning for the Foreign Policy Review?
Well, I would just like to ask MAGUS to elaborate. He has a wonderful blog, and everyone should make part of their reading life. And I've been following it, and I'm very much interested in hearing him elaborate here on his views of poetry and politics in reference to what the work he's done on the blog. It's quite interesting. A number of things that he's been involved in have been very personal, involving immigration, and so I think to hear what he has to say apropos of his blog would be an interesting way to open the show. So I'm just going to pitch it over to MAGUS and let him elaborate.
Well, thank you for having me back, Dustin and CARLO. I really appreciate it. It was really an interesting conversation before, so I will take your question as an opening to it. The conversation we had about poetry and politics and what the role of each and how they interplay has been something I've been working on and mulling over, and on a personal level and as an artist. And so I have a Substack newsletter blog called Poetry, Thought, Word Magic, and you can find it on Substack under that title and under the title MAGUS Magnus Substack at Substack. And what I've been doing since I've started, what this allowed me is to continue my work as an artist, which I've basically throughout my life done things by projects. I write poetry, but I often have found myself being able to be inspired by having a book project. So I frame the poetry I'm writing in terms of a book. And in that case, I'm working for several months to years at a time. And then you wait for the book to come out, and you're not, that's your life. You're working on the work, and then it comes out later. And I felt that the times, actually, this is the political aspect, the times which have become for many people really difficult to even contend with their meaning, and the meaning of the polarity in our country and the meaning of what's going on globally. The times have impinged upon that, and I wanted something that I could connect with more topically and more locally. And that, I think, so I'll want some response before I go on, just monologuing. But that, I think, is sort of key here. As writers, we write outside of time, but there is this aspect of trying to stay topical or local, or at least responsive to what's going on right now. And that is one aspect of what this blog has been trying to do, which is maintain my space as an artist, and yet give little glimpses to myself even, and to certain readers of mine, what being creative in the moment means when you're also interacting with the current events.
So how much can the topical and the political develop meaning, I mean, say existentially, for readers, for writers, for the populace? I mean, is it something that we should address in terms of, the existential value of the political modus operandi going on? Like you mentioned, the divisions and the schisms going on in our own country. There's a lot of global unrest, the pandemic, just a lot of things going on. How much do we have a stake in developing meaning from all of this?
Oh, I think that for me at this point, we have a huge stake, and even just as artists, partly because of how much it impinges upon us. And so, and I think this goes back to that earlier question, which is what I could, as an artist, I could hole up and tune everything out. And yet, is that the right thing to do? And there are times when when we have when in non-interesting times, when those are good times for an artist, then you can flourish. But are you really challenging? Or are you being challenged by the world? I think for many people, we might have disagreements about our politics in different ways, but I think many people are being challenged by the issues that are in the world. And I think, and this is some of the topics that were coming out, how much does that challenge our purpose as artists? Now, I have a feeling in this debate that we're having with the three of us, all three of us, I know CARLO well at this point in our lives. We've known each other for a while, and I'm just getting to know you, but I think I could perceive that all three of us are committed artists first, like above all. I feel that sense that, and that's not a common calling. Not that many people in the world have that sense, like, my purpose is to be a poet or a writer. My purpose is to do art. And I think that's a great calling. What happens when you need to justify that calling? Or maybe beyond that, I think this process I've had, which has, I had our conversation a few weeks ago, that led to my further developing ideas for the newsletter about art and activism. And that also had a follow-up call, which I titled Art, Activism and Temperament, which also acknowledges everybody's, whether they're artists or not, sense of whatever their level of commitment to whatever they're doing also pertains to the way they're made, basically, the way their physiology or psychology is made. All these things I think were worth exploring in these thoughts. I think I'm beyond the point of saying I need to justify my art, but I think I need to say, in the face of the onslaught of, why is our art justified? Why do we have that instinct that we should be doing poetry, even in spite of the fact that there are so many challenges facing us?
There was an interesting question I raised to CARLO before the show. I mean, poets are a disgruntled and dysfunctional batch of people, it seems like, and at least in a broad sense. I'm not saying all, obviously it's not a generalization. I'm just saying, for the most part, it seems like poets are very dysfunctional. They have a hard time adapting to the reality we're facing, and yet we want to define and confine it in some way that makes it valuable to others. And as I was jokingly saying about Jordan Peterson's remark, clean your room before you face the world kind of thing, which is a very social conservative remark. I mean, so what is it about us artists that we want to engage in reality? And are we really trying to fix things, correct things, or are we just trying to negotiate with the world we're facing?
Well, that's for MAGUS, right?
No, I want to hear a few words from you too, CARLO, right now. And
yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that's the key question. I don't really know where to begin because my head exploded with what MAGUS talked about. One thing that occurred to me and that Rosalie and I discussed during the week was that poetry has not always been a corrective to the world.
Right.
In fact, that's a very recent phenomenon. There's been flare-ups. I mean, obviously the Romantics, Wordsworth, the environment, Blake, the environment. Uh, uh, Byron wrote 2 brilliant poems about the Luddites. Shelley wrote a brilliant poem about Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian slave revolt in support of it. But by and large, poetry that's memorable before or outside of the romantic anomalies, you had people like Tennyson and Kipling who were writing pro-imperialist poetry. That is poetry that actually supported the establishment and supported quite profoundly. And in a certain way, you could say Longfellow did the same thing, and Whittier and those people, that even though they did have, say, abolitionist leanings in case of Whittier, and other poets did have kind of humanistic impulses. But if you go back farther and farther in time, that's less and less the case. I mean, the humanist impulse becomes a universal impulse, and that Shakespeare and Chaucer, for example, would be. I think they'd be the best examples in English. So that you have a kind of enduring quality in Shakespeare and Chaucer that has been lost in contemporary expressions of the human condition, and it's partially been lost because of I don't know whether it's a kind of fact-based or data-based response, this interjection of political theory into our political impulses into poetry that directly address the conditions. It's not that the conditions of the time weren't being addressed within these poems. Dante, for example, I mean, it's obviously the Guelph and the Ghibellines. He's talking about the politics of his time, but it's transcendent. What doesn't happen now is transcendence. So I'm going to get a little personal here. That's what I've been trying to do for the last 15 years after I abandoned the Canto style, of which I explained global climate change through the epistemology of science. Okay, that's done. But what I'm working on now is a satire of John of Revelation. You take John of Revelation, it's an absurd. Obviously, the guy was eating too many datura seeds. He was on the island of Patmos, and where stinkweed is growing everywhere. So he's eating stinkweed and having these hallucinations, and it gets into the Bible. Well, I use that as a kicking off point for the kind of contemporary QAnon expression of reality. And it's through it's a monologue, of course. So it's through the voice of a merchant, of an Ephesian merchant who goes to Patmos to do his trade, and this dirty, filthy, crazed guy that's just doing too many drugs gets in his way constantly. So this guy's constantly commenting, and I do it through the actual language, through working through John of Revelation. Well, that has huge contemporary ramifications. And that's why I'm doing it, because I want to be in the Shakespeare Chaucer mold. I don't want to be a guy that simply talks about, in a kind of graphic way, which I can't do very well anyway, about, children being ripped apart by U.S. drones. We know that's going on. But if you could find some form of it, I feel, if you could find some form of expression that and I don't even want to really theorize this notion, because it's more an artistic notion than it is a philosophical or epistemological or any kind of notion that lends itself to outside expression. But if I can find a voice that can really get into that evil, then I'll bring it forward. And I've got a book at my publisher right now I wish he'd hurry up and get it done, but get it published. But that is full of, it's 22 monologues, and they all deal with essentially historical context, but they all have this kind of universal ramification. Mm-hmm. What I find lacking in current political poetry is that kind of enduring quality, that kind of transcendence that you find in the greatest literature of all time. And I'll add one other thing. I mean, you have your Kiplings and your Tennysons, but you also have your Pounds and your Eliots. Mm-hmm. Basically, they were here, and I picked up this great personae at a sale, and it's obviously a professor, and it might actually have belonged to I can't remember his name offhand. This famous guy who wrote a couple of books on Pound, and Pound is so disgusted with America in Personae, in several of his poems. He can't stand it. It's the most stupid place on earth. And to me, it's still the most stupid place on earth. Mm-hmm. He and Eliot, they flee, and they go to Britain and ultimately, Europe and Paris and Italy. But they're also both anti-Semites and fascists. I mean, it's Pound much more pronounced than Eliot. But still, nowadays,
hold that thought.
Nowadays, all the poets are leftists. Okay, that's done. Go ahead.
Well, you had led to a couple of things that I want to respond to, and I think there are two parts of the bulk of what you were able to say. One, I think, was very strongly part of. I'm sorry, my dog is barking, so I apologize for that right now. I don't know if that's
heard me.
Dogs of war.
Okay, but in general, our last conversation really did this interplay that has to do with what you're talking about, where when part of art is to make something enduring, and one of the main techniques that you're talking about in your own work, and you also mentioned Dante, is you might be responding to contemporary events, but you're putting it on a bigger palette. You're putting it on a bigger landscape, whether it's historical characters that then become universal, or Dante, who then created a whole cosmology, but also put his enemies into hell. So these are ways that the techniques of art universalize something. But you also ask this question: what type of forms can do the same thing without just being blunt, raw ravings or rantings? And one of the claims, and I like first bringing that up as a leftist claim of the avant-garde, is that these forms are here we're breaking down conventional forms. That supposedly breaks down conventional thinking or imperialist thinking or imposed thinking from the top through different levels of experimentation. That was something I wanted to bring up as a topic as well on the same course, but even right away to mention a few things. The innovators, like I think Pound was a great innovator who represented not that, which was and the Italian futurists were avant-garde creators who ended up, being able to just dive into war and really be part of the theory underpinning fascism. And so it isn't the forms alone. I argue against the idea that hailing unconventional forms and avant-garde forms as also being, it's not the forms alone that create the change. But I think all of us, whatever's happening with our political stance, there's an instinct that I think of this process over the last few weeks examining this. I know that we're engaged in this instinct that art is justified no matter what else is happening. But why? And some of that answer isn't just that we are trying to create something enduring, but it does represent an ideology, not necessarily romantic, that the individual expression, or even expression could be deconstructed, but an individual mind at work in creation is in itself subversive. And that's exactly what's oppressed by totalitarian systems, tyranny, and also the tyranny of conventional thinking and conformism.
I have an interesting question that I think is both part and parcel of this discussion, a little bit outside of it. Now, I've noticed that there's been observations lately, and it's probably been since the 60s at least, about cultural narcissism. Now, I think that the idea that the arts can transform reality, or that they should be out there promulgating some sort of, I don't know, political ideology or whatever, is a kind of narcissism. And I wonder if that culture is somehow related to the political structure, or if the social environment per se that's creating the same exact attitude that something must change and we must change it and we must use the arts. Rather, I agree with Magis that this is the art in and of itself, the individual penning something beautiful and creative and meaningful in the privacy of their own space is subversive. I mean, because the whole world is so much against all those things, and another thing I've always said is love is subversive as well in this world. And I think that's a very powerful statement. But what I'm getting at is, like, is there something culturally that's ruining the arts that is also involved in the politics? And this word narcissism is getting bantered around quite a bit. And obviously it means a lot of things to a lot of people. To me, it just means, a sort of undercurrent of extreme self-interest that is very also deceptive, So I think that it's very much a problem that we think we have to use the arts to transform things. And I think that's getting into that question is, I think, I can't remember the author's name who wrote the book on how America's culture was narcissistic, and it was developed. I can't even remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few years about how much that sort of social psychology relates to the creation of the arts. And it seems like we're all kind of indoctrinated to think that we can transform things and make reality after ourselves, when really it's more about that privacy of that space and being subversive. I mean, of course, Dante, I don't think he ever expected to really influence his countrymen when he wrote, Divine Comedy in the light that we would normally assume. But it's about the storytelling and getting I don't know if that in and of itself could transform a culture per se. It gets other narratives out there. It's free form and free and loose, and there's a lot of and I've been kind of rambling a little bit, but I'm getting at is how much of the political structure. So many artists are not artists. They're jumping into a cultural thing, and they're not committed artists. They're they'll jump out of that as soon as it gets too hot. And there's that undercurrent of faux activism and all this that's being indoctrinated into people. Somewhere it has to come from some source. I mean, I don't know if it's something.
I love what you said about love too. Like when you mentioned love in a particular way, I'm going to bring that back later. Like I want to hear what CARLO has to say, but I do want to say that love is something the same way art is something that has to already have its own sphere at work for it to be what it is. And so that it's like, that's even why I sometimes use words like magic and stuff like that. Like love itself can be psychologized. It can be reduced to chemicals, all that stuff, but that's not what it is. And then, and that
I use that word in that loose sense to mean a lot of those things too. Like the way we try to reduce very, human empathy to like some sort of weird, mechanism of some kind, like make it science, make a science on human empathy. And, that's all part and parcel of what I'm talking about. It's like the culture is trying to over critique things and indoctrinate people to be certain things. And they go out and, we have to we don't even know what we're facing really out there. A lot of times we don't have a full capacity. That's where I was mentioning arts being so dysfunctional and disgruntled. It's like, what do we really have at stake and moving reality forward?
Yeah. CARLO, any response first too?
Well, the notion of being subversive just by doing art, I think it's more like now it's being convenient for the powers that be that a lot of people think they can do art or do art. I think that really kind of for the powers that be, who are essentially psychopaths, that just takes a lot of the problems away that they would have with truly subversive people. I mean, if there were, say, as many poets, let's say a requirement for writing poetry was to plant bombs in power plants, then there'd either be fewer poets or there wouldn't be any power plants standing. Okay,
right.
That's the kind of extreme I see. So I don't see any merit in this notion that writing is subversive in any real sense. The only one I can think of is the only group I really don't mind associating with, because they've taken me out of total obscurity, and that is the National Beat Poetry Foundation, and the Beats really did do a really were part of a real cultural shift, and that was sort of the last time. There are other cultural shifts. You have the Lowell Sexton Plath School, the Freud, which is essentially the Freud school, and that's been detrimental to poetry, because it's allowed people who simply have neuroses to feel that expressing those neuroses, and which often bleed into their politics, very often bleed into their politics, because most poets are leftists now, or associate with the left now, or liberalism, or whatever you want to call it, this namby-pamby version of the left, that they kind of like, with that, at once they satisfy their own need for political expression. Oh, look at me, I'm against killing babies. It's like, oh, you're against killing babies? What are you for? So it's like, it's not that whole argument. It just falls apart for me. I want to say one thing about Dante. One word: craft.
Yeah, absolutely. How much of the arts and the subversive activity and the cultural shifts are also related to the tools at hand? I mean, I can give it as an example. One of the things that Beats did that was so popular was travel all over the country and move, do their beatnik, buses and stuff. And a lot of that was because the highways were built at that time, and there was that structure there. Now we have so many books everywhere because of this self-publishing platforms and stuff. So how much of the tools at hand create the culture at large, and how can we kind of like get those tools to be concentrated to where they're actually effective at creating great art and creating a subversive culture?
That the fact that there's so much publishing, as you mentioned, Dustin, and what you're saying, Carlo, actually was exactly the flip side of what I was trying to explore, and totally related to the narcissistic society, where you have that idea that everybody can be a poet and artist, and how much that helps fit in both the corporate structure and the overall structure of the powers that be. That it's a form of pacification to say everybody's creative, no matter what you do. It's so easy to be creative. I mean, here we are going to take all your data while you make a little video on your phone, and everybody can say it's great, and we're going to keep selling you in that way. That I totally acknowledge. And that sense that, doing that type of thing is somehow truly creative and subversive. That's the flip side. But I still think, and I think this was sort of what I was really getting at behind there, and it fell right into that trap. Like, it fell right into that trap. But it's like the question of love and art, that what you are describing, though, are not people who are thinking and having free minds. And when the suppression of free minds, I think that idea that I guess that sense of channeling all free minds into just being their own commodities, it does exactly what you're doing. It's another form of pacification. And yet I do think that there's that need. That's that is still a mechanism of repression. It's like, if we're not going to have it, if we're not going to say, I'm not really satisfied with my little 2 cents being thrown out there on TikTok, I actually am not, that's not my message, even though it becomes so many people's message. That's where I think that's the question. Is there that's the question that I think still remains. And if I think the answer you're presenting is it's enduring craft, which has nothing to do with the times. And I'm wondering if there's some other answer as well. So,
well, oh, you want to say something, Dustin? Go ahead.
No, I was about to think out loud a little bit. I do that often, but no, go ahead, go, Carlo.
Well, I just wanted to elaborate on something you said. It's very true. Is that the social structure and the physical structure of the highway system, which was built under Eisenhower, was totally antithetical to the beat movement in a sense.
Really?
He was like say the one of the poster childs for what the 50s represented to the beats. And I never lose sight of that. I'm trying to think of examples offhand, but and actually Magus pointed up a good example about going on TikTok and then having all of your data taken. But the big example for me is when I realized that in a former life, if I go back, say, just a handful of generations in my family, I could have never been a poet, because I would have been a pig farmer. That's what my family did in Bari, Italy, and they raised potatoes. They had a grapevine, and they were illiterate, and the notion of writing poetry was the remotest thing in their mind, and it's still kind of a foreign thing for me to do in my family, because frankly, a lot of my family's not very well educated. They're big Trump fans, and they're all actually, I've had to cut ties with them all because they're all on the loony right, basically. And in fact, they've abandoned Catholicism to become evangelicals, a great deal of them.
Wow.
So
and I'm thinking that
I just see that as being like, what am I doing? How could I influence politics when politics and culture, like Dustin pointed out, has made it possible for me to do anything like this at all?
And I was thinking to mention, a lot of people don't recognize this. I mean, Marx is associated with anti-capitalist sentiment, but at the same time, he recognized that within capitalism, and within the capitalists and the bourgeoisie, there was a revolutionary force at play. As Carlo mentioned, we could all be farmers, pig farmers, or not all of us, but we would all be, we don't have the comfort and the security of a home and so forth in certain eras of history that capitalism has brought us in this way. And at the same time, it's brought so much decadence and destruction. It's such a contradictory force. And it's interesting to note that, especially with Marxism, which is seen as it's strictly anti-capitalist, and a lot of this is the sentiments being brought out, but that are, being channeled, the revolutionary sentiment. But Marx did view capitalism as sort of at its stage as being above slavery and feudalism. And especially a lot of my libertarian buddies that I know that are very pro-capitalist don't recognize that sentiment in Marx, and they deny it. I just wanted to bring that up. I don't know if that's what your thoughts on that, Carlo, or that that Marx actually kind of viewed capitalism as a revolutionary tool, but not the end game.
Oh well, I'm not. I don't know if I can really comment on that. I don't think I have anything to add to it. I'd want to pitch it over to Magus and see what he had to say about it.
Okay. What do you think?
It's that sense of Marx embracing the intermediate stage before the next stage, and that's interesting on one level. Again, I don't know if I'm in this similar mode to Carlo in acknowledging how deep Marx was on a lot of different levels, but I'd go further into that sense that how much collectivization ended up being the ways that Marx was interpreted. And I think that's related to this question, that collectivization also entering into the arts. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to bring up was that when I was thinking about this topic beforehand, and we were thinking about poets that are interesting, there's a Soviet poet named Daniil Kharms, 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 who is basically an absurdist. So the response was never political, but he also did not conform to the collectivist aesthetics that were coming out and how oppressive collectivist aesthetics are. So I guess first to hold off on for your question, Dustin, is I'm relating to Marx to this question in the sense that communist and Soviet interpretations and Chinese interpretations lead to a lot of more collectivist aesthetics. I think that's pertinent to what we're trying to say about what art is really meant to do. And then again, as this sense that maybe there's a personal way that's not so much uttering politics of the forms, absurdist work like Daniel Carm's was essentially very threatening to a system like that. That first he had to be repressed in his writing, where he was no longer allowed to write, so he became a children's writer. And he was a very popular children's writer in the 30s in the Soviet Union. And then that became also suppressed as well within 10 years because they started to understand that what he was doing through the children's writing was also basically representing a very different way of thinking, living through the embodiment of incredible craft. So, but this would not resonate as any type of political work. It was his voice, which is pretty unique, well crafted, and absurdist, was by itself subversive. And those types of things is sort of what I'm looking at here. Like I could read a few Carms here if I found it.
Okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead. No, Carlo, you go ahead.
I just wanted to say, but I mean, what effect has it had? What I do know about the Marxists I've known is they have absolutely no respect for literature and poetry, and they laugh at it. It goes all the way back to when I knew a Marxist economist named John Halley when he was a young lad. Liam Richter and I, who were both poets, we were all three working at the same bookstore. And Liam and I would discuss poetry in the basement rather than do any work. And John would be down there sitting, and he would just ridicule us for wasting our time on poetry. And that's followed through to the present, because I kibitz with Luciana Bone on her Facebook page all the time. And she has absolutely and she's a film critic. She taught film criticism, and she's a Pasolini scholar. But she has absolutely no respect for any reference I make about poetry. None. It's like I'm the biggest waste of time when I do that.
Pasolini was a beautiful poet too.
That's been my sense of Marxists. I mean, the most profound Marxist poet I can think of off the top of my head is not even truly a Marxist, and that's W.H. Auden. I mean, because he wrote some really fine verse along with a lot of really sloppy verse. But he kind of moved
towards a Christian humanist view, if I understand that. Like he developed from sort of a baseline radical Marxism to a Christian humanist view later on in his life.
Exactly. But who else could you think of that would be? Who else would you put up as the great Marxist poet? Who? No one. They don't value it.
Right. They see the aims of the arts to be political in nature, to be, revolutionary forces. And then I guess poetry and literature and language is seen as, everything has to be seen as a mode of production in the Marxist view. And that's where I disagree with Marx. I like a lot of his sentiments. I like a lot of his thinking, but I disagree that everything has to be material mode of production oriented kind of, that I think language itself and beauty and craft and as we've been speaking of is something that humans need. I mean, just as an example, in nature, birds put, little feathers and strings and stuff in their nest to beautify it, sometimes to attract mates or just to make it look nice. And that's poetry can do that. And it increases, I think it can increase productivity and happiness in people to have beautiful things around, art, a beautiful house, for instance, as we go back to the sentiment, clean your room before cleaning the world kind of thing I was mentioning earlier. I think that beauty in and of itself is impactful. And I think poetry and arts in general is beautiful. And that's what it's meant to be.
And you have of the Russian poets like.
I think we lost Carlo. just briefly
Well,
here?
try to, if he's able to hear us, yeah. And one thing was in the revolutionary part, I think he might have been mentioning that in the 20s, there were great Soviet poets who were part of the Soviet Union at the time, but they became repressed because of ideology. I think ideological oppression
One of the great
is really
writers.
scary.
And
Incredible creativity coming out of the idea that there was massive change. But here's the question I'll put to you, but also if we get Carlo back, that I think like this whole idea we've been talking about, I think it's started to get stronger in me. And I think you speak strongly to it as well. When you talk about beauty and when you talk about love, and that is like this, I think what we're trying to do, and I took it really seriously in myself, and that's why we're having these conversations, that demand that politics has on us, that demand to say, why poetry, in that dismissal that we are exposed to. I think maybe coming out of these conversations, we could maybe define, well, wait a second, maybe we're going to make a separation, but here's, even in hard times, or even in the face of all the ways that one should ethically and morally address the problems of the world, why poetry? Like, what I think we all have the answer, that we have said yes to poetry or yes to art, even when we acknowledge that poets and people who devote their lives to these things are in a place of angst a lot of times, in that place of complaint, and the Hipponics, which was the last piece that Carlo read of mine, and that was an ancient poet who was a poet of complaint. That there's something we're validating in this. What happened to Carlo though? But hopefully
he must have been disconnected, or he lost his network, or maybe unplugged the computer, or something happened. He's gone. He may come back in a little bit. We still have about a good 19 minutes of the program, but we can see if he comes back.
Well, I mean, that's where I would take this. I would say that from where we've been talking. I think I acknowledged that this was a valid question. So I'm asking you, both of you, as we kind of work through all this stuff we've been trying to work through together, as we think out loud and bounce off each other, that idea that I have personally felt that it was necessary to respond to the demand of politics and say, what is our role as poets in this time? And if I think that we all are affirming that there is a role beyond politics, but it's still so difficult to speak of. But I think a sense of like we're actually coming down and saying, well, however much we are poets of complaint, like Hipponics, like we are still saying there's something to this. There's something that we're trying to do, but it might not be to transform the world. What is it for then? What is it? Why are we essentially people who are affirming art and poetry?
Could it be that it's just the craft is helping us make sense of our own reality, and we're confronting, not both just confronting it, and also trying to, take what's around us and make meaning from that, and construct and find something meaningful in what we experience. And it's very deeply personal. I think that when a great poet is in his space, or his or her space writing, sorry, it's a sacred space. That's to be theological about it. That's where God is residing. Is like in this space, in this particular moment when the poet is in craft, writing out longing and despair in the form of a lyric, or an epic, or whatever, and trying to reach out into the world what they're wanting to say and what they see, and that's really how I perceive the arts, is and the sacred function of the arts. I don't think it's going to transform anything. I agree with Carlo that it gives voice to a lot of ongoing sentiments. And we mentioned there was a Bob Hickok essay I mentioned some time back, that was talking about, because there's no risk and no money associated with poetry, it can be stronger in its voice for change, but not make that change, but be the voice of that change, and be, prophetic in the sense that it's not going to, it's going to be underlying the currents that are already changing in the society, and the forces, the powers that be, since they're not really as invested in it, that underlying current is coming up, and it's shifting, but the poetry itself is not changing anything. But the poetry, it's the voices are sort of, I guess you could say, predating that change in a way, because the poets that are writing are seeing those changes taking place in a way. And since it's not necessarily, a capitalist venture, capitalism, has both radical and, in my opinion, radical and conservative elements, but generally it's pretty conservative in this country. But I think that I see that poetry can be the undertow, to put it in a metaphor, of an ocean of change. I don't know if that makes any sense to you guys.
It does. When you could talk about Wordsworth in that regard, and global climate change, or Blake and industrialization, which obviously he was immersed in. So yeah, I'll just say one thing about, I know Dustin has brought this up, that he's, that poetry doesn't other poets don't read other poets and everything. So, but I think that's that has to do with the Freudian dimension, and people want to investigate their own psyche, and everybody else is just basic. And Dustin touched on this just a moment ago. Everybody else wants to also touch their own psyche when it becomes that, and then anybody can be a poet. You don't see them picking up the violin and learning how to play the violin, as a friend of mine used to say. So it really does. Now it's at a point where people who have never read any other poet except themselves consider themselves poets. But I will say, I was with a group of friends, and we were I can't remember the poet we were discussing, but in his lifetime he was not recognized at all, and then he had somewhat of a reputation after he died, and somebody expressed their regrets of that, and my friend Joe Brennan chimed up and he said, yes, but he had the joy of writing it, and that was all he needed. And frankly, when I sit down to write, I have all of this in my head, but I do it because it's the most enjoyable thing I can do. In fact, it's so enjoyable, sometimes I don't want to sit down and do it, because it's not only enjoyable, but it's hard. Yeah. It's hard to do. You can, if you're doing my kind of work, you could spend hours just trying to get a grasp on what the context was for a certain culture that I'm trying to elaborate on in the poem. I don't see that among a lot of other poets. They just simply assume they know, and it's very surface oriented work. And I think the problem is that there should be, and I know people don't want to hear this, there should be standards for poetry, and maybe you could have like an amateur poetry field, which would be most people, and then you could have people who have made it a vocation, and they have to demonstrate that they've made it a vocation. I don't know what the
answer apprenticeship is. Basically.
I'm getting a little far afield here, but I think I've already. What? Go ahead.
I think we can. I do think all of this is pointing to something that's going beyond. I think there's a question of why we're trying to respond in a political fashion, what the calling of politics on poetry. But I think that we're recurring, because I think you might be falling back into narcissism. Like, if our answer is we find joy in writing it, there's not that much subversiveness to that, and I do think that might be the answer, though I'm not satisfied by that answer. But I think something else is hidden here, and I think it's the hardest thing to talk about, which is quality. As someone,
but it depends on what you're writing.
It's undemocratic as well, but it's that sense that I think there's several things here: quality, standards, going for I don't like all poetry at all. I could see why many people don't like poetry. But it turns out that the things that I have read in my lifetime that have been the most important to me, there's a lot of poetry in there. There's a lot of what we call great poetry written throughout history. That's the question of quality. And that's some part of our engagement, I propose. Or at least if we're loving poetry and saying what is that relation to that, an enduring quality. Whatever we're saying, there's something, a transcendent quality. That why poetry and art are like love, or like something like something divine. That's something we're engaged in. And how does that work?
That's exactly what I'm getting at, and that is a good question. Is the Platonic forms, do they descend on the poet and say, command him to write? I mean, is that sort of the thing that's happening here with poetry? I mean, and the words themselves are as representations. Are they in fact Platonic forms in a Wu sense? And they have their own energies and transformative capacities. I had this interesting notion recently that I was having a lot of really troubling dreams over the last, maybe 2 weeks. And I noticed that when I woke up, I couldn't really remember them. But then when I got in a state sort of like where I was when I was asleep, when some of those ideas would come back loosely, but then I would sit down and start to write. And as I was writing those dreams or writing those ideas, they started to make sense. And sometimes they appeared, absurd and stupid. And sometimes they were very profound ideas in the dreams. And I thought to myself, language in its restorative capacity is life itself, a sort of dream that language sets aright. I mean, there was a lot of talk about that. I can't remember which tradition it was, about how language in its restorative capacities is setting the field in order, or as Eliot has in his, and I think it's in The Wasteland, and shall I set my what is it, cities in order, or so, whatever it was, his quote in The Wasteland, shall I set myself in order? And does poetry, even though it's not necessarily obvious to the common person, to even us in many ways, is just the very act of parceling out language, a restorative, concentration of power that brings reality into focus. I mean, it may not transform reality, but it brings reality back to focus in the same way that I mentioned how I had these dreams. And when I got in that state where I was remembering those dreams and I went to write them down, they made sense. Some of them that were just garbles. Some of them had a very interesting archetypal content. And so I came to the realization that maybe just the act of writing is parceling out reality in a sort of Holy Spirit kind of fashion.
I just want to say, go ahead, Magus.
I just want to respond. So I think there's a poetic definition of poetry in there too, which is you use the word restorative, and related to the work I've also there's the concept of restorative justice, but poetry is restorative language. I mean, that's a beautiful concept for the reasons you're describing, the sacred space and the re-sacralization of our use of words, that carefulness of our use of words, that sense that there's something sacred here, and then engaging in words in that way creates a space for yourself, but also for the language that it's being used, which has some relation to how it's received. So, I mean, language emits from us, even if we're not sure who our readers will be. And that's the restorative of language.
I want to say one thing, very practical thing, and that is when I came up when I went to the university to avoid the draft, I spent my days interpreting great poetry. We sat down and we analyzed it. Now it's not fair to analyze people. You get people write the most outrageous crap, and if you point out to them that this doesn't work, or that doesn't work, or this doesn't have any craft, or it's just simply prose broken up into lines, they're offended, and to the point where people don't understand real poetry. They don't get it. I get it all the time. I mean, the greats, they don't understand.
The hearts of the people writing.
If you're not going to fucking have this critical discussion on a constant level, if somebody's going to send a poem, people send poems on my feed all the time. I read them. Sometimes I comment on them. and I don't like them, and I'll point out something about it that I think is a flaw, and they're just totally offended, and it's obvious that they can be helped. I mean, I'm not an idiot when it comes to poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I've been reading it now for 50 some years, 60 years. So for Christ's sake, I think I know a little bit about it, but they don't want to hear it. They don't want you picking apart poetry. That's another major flaw with this.
Right.
Everyone can be a poet, because
and I think it's the idea that, and it's so prominent in our culture, we're being so oversensitive these days that we can't offend, or forbidden to offend. And that comes down to, like, there's like this sort of indoctrination or cultivation of people as being too soft. And when you have a poem and you can't critique the poetry out of for fear of offending the poet, or fear of offending the reader, it's like the same capacity being done, and not being able to offend people, for if you use the wrong phrase and referring to the wrong group of people, you're black, you're just blacked out, you're gone.
But that same sort of
it's a kind of narcissism, in my opinion.
It's a kind of bourgeois, white liberal,
mm-hmm.
You're hurting my feelings sort of bullshit thing.
Right.
And frankly, it has no place in poetry. And frankly, I think anybody that doesn't like, I enjoyed sitting in a classroom and interpreting Spenser's Faerie Queene. I loved it. It was like, good Lord, here's all this Christian Catholic iconography, which I was steeped in when I was a kid, unfortunately, but I could understand a Faerie Queene like crazy. But people don't want to sit down and spend time with great poetry and interpretation. They want some spoon-fed psychological or political condition fed to them. And then they go, oh, wow, that was so wonderful. And now here's my wonderful piece. And they're glad handing.
They're looking for the ideological components.
So fucking stupid. It's not even worth considering the political influence the poetry can have.
Right.
Because, as Dustin has pointed out in the broader context, it doesn't have any influence. That's what we have to face here. It doesn't have any influence. It's the kind of passive pseudo-leftist psychology that's dominating poetry. It's not the poetry that caused that. It's what Dustin pointed out. It's the material luxury that caused that. It's the ability to be able to fucking do that and not having to slave away in the fields all day.
Nietzsche had an interesting quote where he says, we'll start arguing over the mosquito bites of the soul. And when things are so comfortable, it becomes the mosquito bites of the soul that we're so composed with. And that's what I feel like, in this capacity of, we're complaining about history, and poetry. I mean, history and addressing historical wrongs. And I get that, but it's not like we're going to change history by writing a poem about, trying to completely dismantle the system using poetic forces. It seems just completely pretentious, bogus. I mean, there's just no word. I don't know. It just feels like it's some sort of like reactionary tendency based on, the sort of material conditions we're in, like the luxurious, as we spoke of, the luxury of just being able to sit and contemplate things and complain about the stupidest thing in the form of poetry. My boyfriend, such and such, my girlfriend, such and such, or whatever it is, and that's not really the force of poetry. I mean, poetry deals with, if it has to be political and social, it goes to the broader forces. It goes to the deeper forces of human nature and sort of transcendent quality and universal qualities of those things. That's my feeling for it.
Magus, your point. Your two
cents. I think I'm in this space now that I would say, in conclusion, we're affirming poetry not for any social or political purpose. And I don't even know if we're affirming it. We're just in it. We're in poetry. But when you talk about how people treat it, and also I think you're talking a little bit about the educational system and also the collegiate orientation to poetry. There was a form of learning poetry that was still active when I was in school, which was basically explication, or basically looking at the text. And that is now, that's been ideologically undermined, but that idea has a presumption that there is something there in the text and in the poetry. And I think that's where I stay affirmed, that there's something there. And as a poet and as a writer and as an artist, you're trying to create a new entity that has this special something, this hidden something. But if you're in the mode of explication, that's where, whenever I was reading with classes, something magical happened. That's where, like, okay, I'm learning how to read this work. I'm expanding myself by learning how to read this work. And that's more than just a joy, because I experienced joy, but the joy was that I felt enlarged by my reading, and that was something that stuck with me. I saw the world better than I did before. I had better lenses. I had better ways of framing things because I was helped through explication, through honoring of the text itself, through saying there is something here in this work that's worth you changing yourself and becoming educated, learning how to read, learning how to learn from this. There is something there that one can learn from. And that is that idea that you could tell someone, you can grow from this, you can learn from this. Well, that's taboo across the board on practically every political level. So,
well, I believe we've reached an hour's worth of programming, and I think we had an excellent discussion. I think we've kind of combated and bantered about two different views of the political influence of poetry and how it's been is it influential, and then why are we even thinking in terms of politics when it comes to the writing and craft of writing. I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you both for joining us. It's been very pleasant. Foreign Policy Review, go back and watch that program, subscribe to our channel, and tell us what you think. This has been an excellent program today about the craft of poetry, its politicalization, and whether or not even politics, it has influence. Does storytelling have a broader social merit to changing society, or does it sort of measure society and predict the forces of change as they are arriving on the scene? What is it that makes the human mind and its craft and its ability just continue to want to engage with the world? That's something we've been engaging with for quite some time as writers, and I enjoyed this program today. This has been the Foreign Policy Review. You guys have a great afternoon out there, and watch World Inkers Network later today. Thank you so much. World Inkers Monthly Magazine is a fine source for your literary interests. It's an all-source magazine with poetry, prose, and essays and articles, as well as interviews. It's all full-color art and photography from a variety of voices and artists. You will find this magazine entertaining. This is an all-purpose readership, and we are looking for new voices. This sleek, full-color edition of World Inkers Monthly Magazine will be something pleasant for your eyes as well as for your mind. And we're looking for authors for one book promotion in the mag. Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, and how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative